All right, everyone, if you're a fan of Jordan Peterson's philosophical and psychological work, but you don't necessarily have 2 hours to spend watching each episode in Peterson's new Exodus series, I'll be covering the highlights of each episode so you can still catch up on the important stuff, at least by my estimation. Episode 2 is a lot heavier on the pure theological discussion and disagreement, so let's start with this first part, which is Carl Jung's critique of Catholicism and Protestantism.
So one of Jung's critiques of Protestantism was that the critique of Catholicism is that it might fall prey to the authoritarianism that's in some sense implicit in the Roman-like structure of the church and the hierarchy that's there. But his critique of Protestantism, the danger there was that everyone would become their own church, and then their identity would become self-proclaimed in some fundamental sense, because with no mediating structures between the divine and the person, it's easy for the person in some sense to usurp the position of God. And one of the things that's puzzled me about the recent insistence that people can self-define their own existence is that they're attributing to themselves in some real sense the omniscience, omnipotence, and omnipresence of God, because their stance is something like, I am that I am.
So this is the idea of atomization. So Catholicism is all about having official interpretations of the Bible and having a hierarchy of priesthood and apostolic succession and all this different stuff having to do with an official interpretation of the Bible. Whereas Protestantism, every church, sola scriptura, the Bible itself, the text itself, read the Bible and have a personal relationship with it. And so Protestantism escapes the rigidity of that hierarchy, but then it opens it up to atomization. Everyone can interpret their own Bible their own way, and then you have churches going extremely in weird ways and all that stuff.
I believe in the non-binary God whose pronouns are plural. I believe in Jesus Christ, their child, who wore a fabulous tunic and had 2 dads.
That eventually just become so detached from the text and the tradition itself that it becomes meaningless.
Really see those things as tightly linked. It's one of the things that's tilted me, I would say, ethically in a more conservative direction, because even in the psychotherapeutic literature, you see this Rousseau-like underpinning, which more or less assumes that sanity is part and parcel of the autonomous individual. And so there's a Rousseauian element there, there's a Protestant element, and a classic liberal element. And I've fallen prey to that to some degree by thinking of the sovereign individual as the fundamental unit of value. But then, and this is partly under the influence of Piaget and the theorists of play, and the people who made the case.
Real quick, he said he's fallen prey to the sovereignty of the individual, meaning he, by his own estimation, is too focused on individualism, and he's increasingly adopting a more communitarian perspective.
Is that identity comes out of negotiation, that in order to be sane, which is something other than, let's say, self-actualized in the narrow sense, you have to be positioned in these hierarchical structures. So you can't be sane without a partner, without a long-term partner, let's say. Or if you don't have a long-term partner, you better have some children or some parents. And if you don't have them, you better have some friends. And if you don't have them, you better at least have some colleagues and a town and a city and a state and a country, all the way up the hierarchy. And that what the sanity then becomes is the symphony-like ordering of that entire structure, rather than the autonomous health of the autonomous psyche, self-defined, also conjuring up the notion that all of that embeddedness is nothing but an imposition in the manifestation of your autonomous self, which is also something that Rousseau would tilt towards, right?
Meaning, your sanity as an individual and your morning routines and your diet and all the things that make up your life are dependent on a functional society. So the focus on the hyper-individual perspective of it's all internal, it's all psychological, is a mistake, because your existence as an individual is nested in a much broader hierarchy. It's an extension of an idea that Peterson has put forward in his lectures previously.
The psychoanalytic idea is sort of like, well, if you just got your act together, everything would work out for you. It's like, yeah, there's some truth in that. But if you're 55 years old and you've just been laid off work, and maybe through no fault of your own, it isn't obvious how much getting your act together is going to help you find another job, because the actual problem that you're facing may have relatively little to do with you.
This part is a interesting theological disagreement between the Jewish worldview and the Christian worldview, and it really highlights how these faiths are different at a fundamental level, or at least in the interpretations that are presented here.
Jews look at suffering with the following statement: it stinks. And Christians look at suffering as being Christ-like. Do you all agree with Jonathan's comment that God turns all evil into good? Is that a generally agreed to proposition at this table?
I would say we're going to find out. I mean, that's partly what we do as we live.
For the record, I've never understood that line. Christian callers began telling me that phrase. I had never heard it in 15 years of yeshiva. And I'm troubled by it because if it's true, then A, why battle evil? Number two, doesn't it sort of trivialize?
Why not just leave it all up to God?
Well, yes, if he's going to turn it into good, I'm going to watch TV. The evil that people have suffered, in my opinion, I can't tell a Jew who saw his children gassed, hey, listen, God's going to turn this into good.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe in the hereafter, that I do believe in very deeply, but you don't mean in the hereafter. You all meant in this world.
No.
Well, okay, so...
In the ultimate analysis.
In the ultimate... Okay, all right, so then I'll go back to number one. Why fight evil if he turns it into good anyway?
Well, I would say, I can't speak theologically. I would say the way I look at that is the same way, in some sense, that I interpreted the story of Moses, is that one of the manners in which God transforms evil into good is by calling on us to do so.
But we don't transform bad into good either. We destroy bad, hopefully, but we don't transform it. The raped woman remains raped. If we defeated the Nazis, but the Nazis caused, I don't know, tens of millions of people to die horribly.
But the question is not whether terrible things, in fact, utterly horrific things happen. It's whether there's any possibility of redemption of those very things.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And to what degree that's redeemable.
So, by the way, and I say this with love, and I mean it, I'm not being in any way patronizing. That's a Christian view of suffering. So I got to tell you this, forgive me. Everybody knows Jews complain more than other groups, certainly more than Christians. So that's a given. I even have a test. Get a Christian, get a Protestant, Catholic church, and a Jewish synagogue grouped together for lunch, an ecumenical lunch, and I arrange in advance to serve overripe cantaloupe. Which group will complain the most? Everyone knows the answer. The Jews will complain the most. Okay.
For members of the Mossad or ADL watching my videos, I renounce this. This is disgusting anti-Semitism.
So that's not a riddle. The riddle is why. And I have a fun theory, which I won't bother with, and I have a serious theory. And the serious theory is Jews look at suffering with the following statement: it stinks. And Christians look at suffering as being Christ-like. And that's the difference in views of suffering, which is fine. I love the fact that we don't agree on everything because we enrich each other. But I really do believe that the view of suffering is different. The word redemption, as was just used, that God will redeem this suffering is not a concept I am theologically or emotionally comfortable with.
That part stood out to me. Just Jews regard suffering as fundamentally bad. Christians regard suffering as an opportunity to be redeemed, as an opportunity to embody the Christian ethic that Christ lived by. Again, as someone who has no background in theology and knows very little of, what's being discussed here at a deep level, it's interesting to see these flashes of, that's the disagreement here. Because it's very easy to say, well, these are all a bunch of conservatives who like religion. It's like, yeah, but they're of different faiths, and they believe obviously each person believes their faith is correct. And so to see these differences manifest themselves is just very interesting and informative. This last point is a classic Petersonian point about the alignment between the biological reality of ethics and morality and the transcendent narrative description of morality as per the Bible.
Well, then you can borrow that down to neurology, evolution, and hormones. And to your point, right, that reaction of a mother to the cry of a baby, right, it can be proved out here, but that's not all that it is, right? Because then you're into the train of the intellect that falls in love with itself, right? It's one piece of it, but the pattern should be, right?
Isomorphic. Well, and I
right.
think it is. Like I think I mentioned yesterday, I don't remember if it was in this context, but Frans de Waal's work on the structure of social hierarchies in chimpanzees shows pretty clearly that stable chimpanzee troops are predicated on the spirit of peacemaking and reciprocity.
That's partly why I'm often interested in talking to biologists. You know, I've talked to Frans de Waal most recently, and he's a primatologist who's worked on elucidating the principles by which chimpanzees organize their social hierarchies. And the Marxist, really, and classic biological take on that for simple-minded biologists is that the chimps use will to power, right? The alpha chimp is the most powerful, most dominant, meanest, roughest, boxer, oppressor. And de Waal's work, conducted over about 30 years, has showed that that's not just wrong, it's anti-true in some sense. So it's exactly the opposite of the reality. Now and then you can get a chimp who rules by power, but it destabilizes the troop emotionally and socially, and his reign tends to be short, brutal, and meet an extremely violent and murderous end. It's not an effective strategy, and what de Waal has shown that is to stabilize the iterative interactions within a troop. The alpha male, who sometimes can be the smallest male in the troop, has to be more reciprocal than any other individual in the troop. And so the basis of chimpanzee power is peacemaking, reciprocity, and stable long-term social relations between males and between the more authoritative males and females.
In other words, morality and what we consider ethical is not a social construct. It's rooted in our biology because that's the evolutionarily stable strategy that survived over a long enough period of time to select for primates and our early primate ancestors who abided by that ethic. And so chimpanzees and our early ancestors that were ethical by our standards were not just engaging in some socially constructed behavior, but were doing something that facilitated survival and the reproduction of genes, hence it being deeply rooted in who we are as humans.
That's the fundamental principle. It's not power. And so even among chimps, there's this ethical... It's ethical interaction. There's no real other way of saying it.
Or your argument about the ratio of dominant to submissive rats in play, and when they will go submissive.
It's exactly the same thing, isn't
right.
it? It's the spirit of play that keeps rat societies alive.
But
right.
that thing doesn't exist on its own as just an odd rat behavior.
No.
Right? That's all about this asana alignment, let's say.
Well, and you see, Panksepp discovered play circuitry in mammals. You also see it in birds. I mean, so that spirit of voluntary association and voluntary play, which is, I think, really, in some real sense, the antithesis of power, that's so deeply instantiated biologically that it has its own independent circuitry. So you see there an alignment, and you'd expect that. Why wouldn't there be alignment between the biological and the transcendent?
So those were the highlights from episode 2. I plan on doing this for every episode that comes out, so thank you for watching, stay tuned, and good luck, and Godspeed.